Thank you everybody for coming back so promptly. We've got a very well behaved group of participants here today. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Louise has asked me to, if you haven't already, there's a book, a bit like a big version of an autograph book that my mother used to have. It's fantastic. So just write your little bon mots in there, or you can write a page or two or three. It's entirely up to you. You can draw pictures. But it's in the middle room, so make sure if you have a bright idea or even a pretty crummy idea, you can leave it for posterity. The other thing is John Matthews has asked me to give Terry Nolan's apologies. He's got a good excuse. He had to go to Geneva suddenly. And so if anyone else wants to give an apology with a good excuse like that, now's your time, or you can write it in the book or something like that. I've been amazed at every time I meet some of Kerin's colleagues, I always discover some new piece of the mosaic and the jigsaw and the huge network, including internationally. And I'd been out of Australia for 4 years working in Southeast Asia in refugee camps, and I went over to Harvard to do my MPH, and we're setting up house with a group of, we're all students again, in the worst suburb of Boston, Mission Hill, and we couldn't get any TV, and we wanted to get some news. And so we had to connect up to the cable, which involved paying money. And the first thing we tune into, the picture comes up and there's Kerin. And I nearly fell over. And I said to my housemates, I know that lady. And she was being interviewed about of course, the 1982 study. And this was 1992. So it was just the novelty of this and the significance of it was really still penetrating. And I guess that's the most extreme version. But I've still bumped into people who have some connection to Kerin. So it's really quite extraordinary. For myself, it's one of my most valued and best and most important from a career-wise and also personally to have known Kerin. And I first met her when I picked her up from Alice Springs Airport in 1987. And she was on her way to work with us to do some community screening at Hermannsburg and later in Utopia. And it was about a year. I'd been there a couple of years, and I was the GP for Hermannsburg, and we were just discovering more and more and more, mainly women becoming obese at an early age and getting type 2 diabetes. And I guess it was the beginning of the epidemic as we could understand it, at least in Central Australia. And in the Torres, it had been discovered about 20 years earlier than that, I suppose. But Kerin, in her usual fashion, was giving me the latest intelligence on the science behind this and explaining the thrifty gene hypothesis. And I thought, well, what does that mean? Does it mean that we just kill them or let them die? I mean, this is really weird. What are the consequences of this kind of thinking about this? And years later, after I'd been working probably for about another 5 years in this area, I was at a conference in Canberra, and Taran Weeramanthri from the Northern Territory was organising a lunchtime session about this huge problem and how it's everywhere and how we as clinicians can best deal with it in a much more holistic way. And a very well-meaning physician from Melbourne, I believe, whose name I forget, lovely man, piped up in the middle of the session and said, well, isn't it all just genetic? And and there was just silence. So I started to notice the therapeutic nihilism around the place, and this is one of the unintended consequences, I suppose, of this kind of thinking, which creeps into a colonial and a post-colonial environment. And this is exactly what I was observing up in the Torres Strait. Anyway, that had a happy ending in 1987 because Kerin stayed with me and she fixed my coffee machine. And we had much better wine and food in Alice Springs for the duration of that. And we were able to follow up that study in 1995 when I went back to Alice Springs in Central Australia to follow up both of those communities with Sabina, who you'll hear about later and see some of those pictures. And unfortunately, we were doing it in the middle of summer, and so up at Utopia we were camping, a bit like the Mowanjum camp, but it was in the middle of summer, so it was March, and the flies were the same. And we did the Hermannsburg surveys a little later in the year, but it was really tough. And here I'd like to just remember an excellent colleague of ours on all of these trips, and who subsequently came back to Melbourne and did fabulous work in Shepparton and at Melbourne University, and that's Kevin Rowley. Who was really just inspirational in his very low-key, very dry way. Sabina will talk about the aftermath of the Central Australian surveys, but one of them was an intervention in that community, which was all about following the doctrine of the time, and that is reducing fat in the diet. And so we had a lot of education sessions in Hermannsburg about trimming the fat off the meat and what you do and substituting different oils, etc. And in the follow-up, we actually found that obesity had increased, as was found globally with the move to high sugar substitution for the villainous fat, and also. That was a result of the 1995 surveys in which Kerin and Mark Daniel and others were able to publish the first incidence study of diabetes in Aboriginal people, certainly just in that cohort. And it was huge. It was 15 per 1,000 person years overall, which was, compared to AusDiab, an order of magnitude higher. And later, when we did the same thing in North Queensland, we found that the incidence had actually doubled in 10 years, over a different period of time. So we were dealing with an unfolding epidemic that we only had a very rudimentary understanding of what was behind it and what to do to influence it. In 1995, I moved over to Cairns and to work with Dimpna Leonard, who's not here, sadly, but who's been a colleague of ours, a public health nutritionist in Central Australia and Cape York for many years, in fact, since 1985, who can't be here today, but she hasn't got the excuse of flying to Geneva, so I guess I can make something up. But Kerin, again, was working with Dimpna, doing these similar surveys, and so we were able to get really good community-level data to inform a diabetes summit that Philip Mills convened, and Ross Spark, who ran the Tropical Public Health Unit out of Cairns at the time. And it was in June on Thursday Island, and we got $50,000 from Queensland Health to get everybody in. All the traditional owners and health service representatives from all the islands, over 3 days, develop a strategy to combat diabetes, including a substantial reform in primary health care, because it was very much a hospital-centred acute care model at the time. And Kerin was highly influential in providing data and providing advice about community-level nutrition interventions. and continued to be involved in that over the years. And I guess now I just want to remember another great collaborator and a great leader who's passed away now, and that's Ross Spark. And that was a sudden and unexpected, well, maybe not unexpected, because as his best friend Gary Egger used to say, every day was a special day for Ross, meaning that it involved special food and lots of red wine, and so that was a real shock to us, and that happened very soon after I moved back to Cairns in 2004. But in the meantime, Kerin had stayed a really good friend of mine, and we often conversed and socialised, and she did me a great favour in coming over to Adelaide at a time when I had a brief period as a university bureaucrat, and she was able to give me the benefit of her mentoring while she was DVC research at Deakin, and gave me lots of hot tips, including, and I still remember this part of it, when I was constantly dealing with bad behaviour, both in my own university and others, bad academic behaviour and I guess occasional abuse by senior people of their more junior colleagues. And Kerin would always say, well, they must feel very insecure in themselves to behave that way. And that approach to it gave me great comfort, because it was more of a sympathetic response rather than a punitive response. And so I've tried to learn that lesson, Kerin, so thank you for that. It wasn't a great time for Kerin in Adelaide, because she kept falling off her bike and falling downstairs, and finally, well, yes, and then coming back to Melbourne and falling off the tram. I mean, really, you know. Anyway, what's really for me been really inspirational and different about Kerin is just the combination in a single individual of great science, being out there in terms of literally being out there in the field and camping in the flies, and then having the time and the effort at great personal and I don't know, but possibly professional, considering the opportunity cost of, you know, what else you could be doing in the lab in Parkville. There are very few people who can span those divides, as well as doing the public advocacy for good nutrition. And so that to me is a really unique feature of this. And I continue to be amazed at the depth and the breadth and the penetration of Kerin's networks, particularly in Northern Australia. And even today I've met people from the Kimberley and the Northern Territory who I didn't know. So thank you very much, Kerin. And one question that I thought you were going to answer briefly this morning about how much weight you lost in 1982. Yes, 8 kilograms. But you also told me that it was such a dramatic weight loss that you could actually feel your kidneys rattling around in your back while you went running. And yes. And and the other part of the penetration of the networks, particularly across Northern Australia, is that I worked for many years in Cairns with Randy Spargo's half-brother, Ernest Hunter, who's also a bit of a legend and continues to be. And Randy had apparently quite an old-fashioned approach to treating Giardia, and that is not to. And so Kerin had to wait till she came back to get another doctor, I suppose. And that's how it was in the old days. And I guess the other question about the ethics is it a sad day for us that we reflect on that now with such groundbreaking and really important work? Could we do it now? And the answer is no, and I think that's actually a really sad thing. It's a really sad thing. So I guess we need to reflect on where we're going as a research community, and how exactly safe do we want to be versus being out there like you, Kerin. So thanks for listening to my little tirade. I think I've delivered all the messages that I need to you. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Berit. Where's Berit? And again, Berit I've never directly collaborated with, but we've published together, courtesy of Kerin. And Berit actually stayed in my house in Cairns soon after I'd moved there in, must have been early '96. And she only stayed one night, but it was the one night of the year where I had a big party. And Berit, it was literally just off the plane. And so I've always admired your fortitude, Berit, because you must have just been wanting to go to bed, but you couldn't. So I'll take it away, Berit. Thank you.
Well, it was a pyjama party, so it kind of felt the right way. Thank you for that introduction. Over the years, I've come to realize that that's the kind of introduction you want, not the introduction where you're told about how many publications people have published and what kind of affiliations they have and so on. No, there's really two things that people want to know, and they're the two things that they're usually far too polite to ask about. So here it comes. I'm 55 years old, and I weigh 67 kilos. Now, with that out of the way, Kerin, you and I, and keeping in tune with the theme here, which seems to be weight and weight loss, you and I, we met in Japan about 30 years ago at the International COPE meeting in Tsukuba. For my part, that was also about 30 pounds ago. But we met sitting on the floor in Professor Suzuki's living room. And we were both quite loud, I guess, as we tend to be, both of us, about the fact that for the international conference in COPE, they seem to have forgotten to invite women. So it was a completely male panel of speakers all over the place. But anyway, we were sitting there, and when you're out with the boys in Japan, you have to do as the boys, and that involves drinking until you drop, and singing karaoke until somebody hopefully stops you. And that might take a long time. And we've heard that you like singing earlier today, that out in the bushes there was singing. And I think that must have been part of the inspiration, because we, on the initiative of Kerin, grabbed a few North American men and then formed a pop-up band that we called The Four on the Floor. And we sang and danced until we basically dropped. And I think that was the beginning of a very long-lasting relationship up until today. Because we have not really collaborated a lot over the year. We have had a few publications. There's been no coherence in it. It's been about pooling data, and it's not really the best of any of our work. But we've had such a good time. We have visited each other in Kerin has come to Copenhagen, I've come both to Melbourne and to Deakin. We've given lectures, we've had a very good time. I remember in Deakin I came with my husband and my two children, one that was 1 year old and the other that was 5. And you had arranged to hire a car, or I don't know, a huge car. I don't think we have cars like that. It was the size of our apartment. And it ran about 2 liters on the kilometer. But anyway, that car took us up to the crocodile sanctuaries, among others, where you walk in small paths and all the crocodiles are lying in big ponds, not doing much, except when there's a little baby at the age of 1 coming by, and they all leap out of water. And as my little baby was in the pram, coming close enough for them to attack. And I was so pleased that evening because we made up for it, because you served grilled croc meat. And I thought that was so nice. But I also really have treasured coming to Australia, and I've come many times. I love the unfamiliar places here, the colors of the soil, the varied bushes and trees and flowers. I mean, I even like the animals, although I'm really, really scared of them. And I love the hospitable people here, and it's always a great time to be here. And then, of course, there's the good climate with lots of sun, whereas we don't really have any in Denmark. I actually love the fact that you spent Christmas on the beach barbecuing. I mean, for one, I'm not dreaming of a white Christmas. Being Danish, I have to say I don't, or Danes in general, don't care that much that Australia might be closer to the sun, that there's a hole in the ozone layer. No, we go out there. We don't wear hats. We have no long sleeve. We lie down and enjoy the sun, sometimes even without sunscreen on. And please bear with us. I've taken this photo on a typical summer day in Denmark. You can see the glass of wine and the rain coming down. And here's me sunbathing in Australia. Yeah, it's me lying down. The one to the left. It's funny, isn't it, how you just sometimes see part of the picture. Anyway, as I said, I do admire the courage of the Australian people, that you come here and you live here and you're not scared of the poisonous animals that sting and bite you and might kill you. I mean, I come from a country where you can actually go out and camp in the nature, even without a tent. You can sleep in the open, just on a mattress, or even without a mattress, just on the soil, and nothing will attack you, nothing will bite you, except possibly a mosquito. Except, of course, it's usually too cold for that. And you can swim in the sea. There will be no box jellyfish or blue great white sharks or blue-ringed octopus. Nothing will sting you. And you can just swim around, except usually it's too cold for that. You can walk, you get the point. But we're here today to talk about happy retirement. And this is the time when you do the things that you want to. You don't have to go and wish anymore for a research grant. You don't have to mark 180 third-year exams. You don't have to anxiously work very hard for weeks for the next audit. This is the time when you could do the research that you've wanted to do, or you can leave it as you want. You have the time to do as you want. And I think at this time, I would like to offer you some advice about happy retirement. And I think I can do that because I'm Danish. And for many years on a row, Denmark has, by the UN, been found to be the world's most happy nation. Even our babies cry less. But one of they found out that there are 6 key metrics that distinguishes happy countries or happy nations from less happy nations. And the first is to have a healthy life expectancy. Now, there's a lot of scientific proof to that. We know that people who have more birthdays will live for longer. And so this is just the key metric where my recommendation is stay on the boat, or get on the boat, and stay alive. The second one is to have somebody to count on. And I think you just have to take a look in the audience today. Lots of people you can count on. We're all there for you, and with great pleasure. And even when your eyesight goes, we'll also be there for you. So stay your friendly you. Now, the next 2 metrics are kind of circumstantial. It's coming from a country with a gross domestic product that's high per capita, and freedom from corruption. Of course, you could move to Norway or Scandinavia and get that a little bit better than here in Australia. But you have tried living in other countries. You stayed in Germany, in France, in the US, and you've come back. So I think the general recommendation would just be stay. The next one is the freedom, the perceived freedom to make life choices. And I think that's a very important point. Because when you retire, you're kind of at the age where you are old enough to know better, but still young enough to do it. So, and that's the kind of era you're moving into. and now also with a lot of time. So my advice here simply is be yourself, as you have always been. Unless, of course, you can be Batman. Then always be Batman. Now, the final key metric is generosity, and as we've seen from the first the slide that comes up, generosity is one of the key issues that we have all ticked and written that we think is your middle name. And there's also some scientific proof to this. Not long ago, about 6 months ago, there was a Nature Communications that showed a neural link between generosity and happiness. What they did was they equipped the intervention group with a quite large amount of money and said, over the next 4 weeks, you go and spend that money on somebody else. And the control group got the same amount of money, but was told to spend that money on themselves. Then they asked people a lot of questions before the intervention and after the intervention, but also did functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what they found was that compared to the control, the intervention group had a stronger increase in self-reported happiness, in fact, a much stronger increase in self-reported happiness. But there was also more connectivity, engagement, and activity in those parts of the brain where happiness, pro-social behavior, and decision-making processes were occurring. So these results are showing that there's a link, a quite strong link, between commitment-induced generosity and happiness. So with respect to generosity, just be you. Because Kerin, you're actually one of the most generous people that I know. Now, while I still have the microphone, I'd like to return to the title of this speak, Did You Not Know? Because when I first met you in Japan, I had not much idea of what you were doing. Basically, we were singing and dancing and having a good time. And then I found out that you actually was not like the rest of us sitting behind your desk looking at your computer. You did real research out in the bushes. And I got this picture from a talk you gave in Hungary, where I was part of organizing a symposium. And the question I've actually wanted to ask you for these 30 years is, did you not know that there are dangerous animals out there? Now, I wish you a happy retirement. Thank you for being so inspirational, for being a fantastic friend, and for always being there, and for having so much fun. And remember that there's nothing that can't be cured with a good laugh and a long sleep. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Sabina, where are you? You're next. I'm told Sabina had a lot of pictures, but did they turn up? A few?
Yes.
Great. So that's what we like about this, lots of bush pictures.
Thank you. It's just a delight to be here, sort of amongst friends and colleagues and people who've shared the life and journey of Kerin. I've turned my talk, it's perfectly okay to get dusty, which was a phrase that Kerin used when we were talking about the fun that we've had, that how important it is to be able to, go bush, how important it is to get, dust on your shoes, that you don't feel like you have to be stuck in, the big city institution to be able to progress your career. And for many of us who've made our careers in the bush and have maintained that connection either, over time, this has been really important. And for me, I always think of you, Kerin, as primarily a friend, but importantly a mentor, a fellow adventurer. You were truly an academic. I'm an accidental academic. It's sort of the risk you took, really, when you were in Central Australia. A supervisor to so many, but always a colleague and a companion on the journey of life and discovery and science. And importantly, community development. And so, I've put this up to the road to Kerin. So this is my old four-wheel drive. So this is in the late 80s, my truck. And there were very few sealed roads around. I first met Kerin, I think, Mandy Lee were you still the nutritionist in Alice in 1985? You'd left. When did you go to Darwin?
About
85. So we formed CARPA at the end of 1984. And I think if my memory's right, and you must have been back down, Kerin first came to Alice for the 1985 CARPA conference, and you were there. I can still see where you were sitting in the side of one room. It's funny how these memories come back to you in the old staff development demountable, Alice Springs Hospital. And CARPA was an extraordinary organisation in that it was just the health professionals of Central Australia across the three borders and the professions and the services, for which didn't have a strong tradition of working closely together, but when it came down to the individuals, everybody wanted to know what we could do to do better. And it was about trying to organise ourselves to understand what we were doing, what we needed to do, and how we'd tackle it. We tackled it sort of systematically. We didn't realise it at the time, but one thing at a time. We started on pneumonia, we went to syphilis. We went then straight to renal disease and then diabetes. And we produced a set of standard treatment guidelines, eventually that went to publication in, we bought them out in a loose leaf folder in 90, but the pocket book was published in 1991, and it had 2 pages on diabetes. And I had to fight to get those in. And Kerin met a large group, of practitioners, nurses, doctors, allied health professionals. Not that we had many allied health professionals. We certainly had more Aboriginal health workers who were fellow travellers of adventure, but also with a strong sense of social justice and commitment, who were trying to sort things out and remained a friend of CARPA and that group for the rest of her professional life, and has had strong connections with Central Australia ever since. CARPA, the reason why CARPA was formed is no longer necessary. It still produces the guidelines, but there's many other ways to bring people together, professional development, etc. And so I came back, and I see John's here today, which is lovely. I came back after doing my Masters in 1989, took up a position with Menzies at Andaria, which is Hermansburg, west of Alice, to work on a diabetes project. The first community screening had been done, I think. I'm getting a bit hazy now. It's a case of if you were there, if you can remember it, maybe you weren't there. Was working on community-wide, trying to identify what were the best strategies, working with the community to work on what were the best strategies to develop sustainable intervention programs that would make a difference. And we worked on a family by family grouping that was reasonably successful, but nowhere near what needed to be. Certainly the epidemic had taken off and was well entrenched. And this photo, this is Dipna Leonard, Annie Bonson from the top end, and myself. And the reason Mandy Lee's not in it is because I think she took it. But there was a small group of people who were working in the newly formed nutrition networks across Northern Australia, who were really interested in having a holistic approach. So we're looking at food supply, trying to understand that whole food supply, making sure that healthy foods were affordable and accessible. The culture on the other side of the counter was incredibly important. The store manager was everything, and ladies, you talked about that, how that really influences what happens. And there was in those 5 to 10 years, so much happened, so much development took place, not just at Indari and other places we've seen most of that go backwards, unfortunately, with the corporatisation of services and the contestability of contracts and the way that the feds do business has made it pretty difficult. But at that time, when I did the second survey in, I think it was 1990, 1991, was when we discovered that 50% of women over the age of 35 were diabetic or significantly impaired glucose tolerant. It was really shocking. And in talking to people, asking them in the family group workshops that we used to do, just yarning circles is what they would call them now, just asking people, do you have high blood pressure? And the most common response from men I spoke to was either yes or not yet. And so people, they didn't actually understand that you couldn't not get it. When I started in 1984 in Central Australia, in the pitlands, there was one diabetic in the community I worked in, and I knew of one other in Pukaja who was the senior health worker. So in 1995, I joined with Robin to do a community survey for Utopia, Papunya and Hermannsburg. And we were out for 7 weeks. It was a pretty long time. She was right, it was hot to start with. But we gathered a willing crew with us, but we because we'd worked closely with community before and negotiated how would they like to do it, and they would tell us, the when and the how, we were able to come back again, and the participation rate was really high. This is the crew. You'll see some of the folk that you'll recognise in there. We had a couple of great BMed Sci students, tall, which was very handy for strapping stuff on the top of the Toyota. They didn't mind getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning because we had to be at whatever place before the sun came up, because the people would have breakfast straight away, cup of tea straight away. So we had to do the miles early. So there's the lovely Kev with our outback lab on the tailboard. Okay. Some of the folk there. So this is the next bit I want to talk about, the real things that I've learnt from Kerin. You've clearly been very influential. When I first came to visit with you down at Deakin, I drove down, this is my dog with the dog on the tucker box, when we came down to Queenscliff. Kerin taught me how to brew beer. Really handy, because I was an enthusiastic beginner, but I really didn't understand the science of it. Well, she straightened me out there, and gave me some great recipes. I'm a great foodie and I like to cook. For a woman who has worked at every level, and you've heard that, so whether it's at WHO in Geneva or whatever, she has never lost her enthusiasm and generosity to give back. I ran a program in Central Australia for teaching remote area nurses, postgrad program where people would come in from across Australia. They would pay for themselves to get there, and she would just organise her travel once a year to be there to teach. So all of those papers that we've heard about, and the presentations and the high level engagement that she would have at the highest level of importance, she would have those conversations with those nurses who are working across Australia, and they of course would have those conversations with their colleagues. So there are many people out there who've been significantly influenced and shaped by your enthusiasm, knowledge and ability to communicate. You rode into the West to start your career, so I'm not terribly sure what you do at the end of the career. I'll just say keep riding. You've spent your career also doing what you love, which is what many of us aspire to do. And so I think retirement doing what you love will be a continuation of that. You've really validated and encouraged people to speak up, particularly the remote voice and the advocates, to remain committed to what's important and stay connected. I think that's incredibly important. You're always a generous host, and I grew up a Catholic and also spent a lot of time on showgrounds, and to come to Melbourne and stay at Kerin's house to find that she's actually wedged between the Showman's Guild and the Daughters of Mary? Legion of Mary, which is something great from my youth. I always wanted one of those blue veils. I thought, what an address. It's a prime address in Australia. People didn't understand why I was so enthusiastic about it. But anyway, probably the Showman's Guild might have been something else that we might have aspired to. But that's me done. We've had some pretty interesting moments, but long time, and I just said people are saying lots of nice things, and that's due, and probably I'd say we've had some rowdy times. They've been great. I mean, if those people can remember them, then you weren't there. I've so treasured. This is a wonderful opportunity not only to honour you as the woman the work, but also the woman behind the woman, which is also terribly important. This stuff doesn't happen when you're on your own, and congratulations, and it's just so lovely to spend this time with you. Thank you.
So Kerin, please come up here. And you've just reminded me that I look at the list here and we're all girls, in this session at least. So thank you.
Oh, that's right. This is the one that puts it forward that way. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm delighted to be able to talk and to talk a bit about my background with working with Kerin over the years. I first came to Geelong after working in Sydney for some time as an immunologist researcher, and my husband decided we'd come to Geelong, and I thought, what am I going to do? I didn't know what I was going to do in Geelong. And then I heard about this brilliant nutrition department, and it was headed by this brilliant woman, Kerin O'Dea, and I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to go back and I want to do a master's in nutrition and dietetics. And I've never regretted that decision. It was a terrific department, and it brought me to do a lot of interesting research in nutrition that I've really enjoyed doing under mentorship of Kerin. So this was the department in 1988, I believe. Kerin, you became the Professor of Human Nutrition there, and then didn't stay as Professor long because she was bumped up and became Dean, and then Pro Vice Chancellor in research at Deakin University. And from that time, I remember, it was a long time ago, but still 30 years later, I remember a fantastic lecture that Kerin gave on breast cancer. I don't know whether you remember that one, but to all the students. And I thought this was typical of Kerin's ability to bring together a lot of different aspects around a topic and make it really very inspirational. She didn't just talk about diet, but she talked about whole diets, not just nutrients, but foods and how they were prepared. So there's the dietary aspect. But into that, she also wove the biochemistry in a really interesting way. Biochemistry, I taught at one stage biochemistry. It's not really easy sometimes to make it inspiring, but Kerin managed to make it really interesting and to link it very much to the nutrients and to the diet. And then again, the endocrinology, that was brought in a very interesting, integrative way. And last but by no means least, the social factors, how our society has been changing, changes in how women breastfeed their babies or don't breastfeed their babies, changes in the time of menarche of young women that influence breast cancer. So in her own inimitable way, Kerin wove all these things together and made a really inspiring lecture. And that was her ability to really inspire people by seeing the big picture, but also coming down to the really specific nitty-gritty things of the science. And I think that's a fantastic ability. And so after being at Deakin, she went off to Monash for a short time and was the Professor of Nutrition and Preventative Medicine at Monash. And there again, Kerin only has to be places a short time to make a big impact, because with Maggie Nile, who's I think I met earlier, she's somewhere here in the audience. Where are you, Maggie? She initiated a Bachelor of Nutrition and Dietetics at Monash. And that degree is still going, Kerin, and it's expanded. We have a picture of where we are now at Notting Hill, nice new facilities, and in particular BASE, which is for Be Active, Eat and Sleep, a fantastic research institute, and it's grown under the auspices of Helen Truby, but also Malcolm Riley, I spot there too, had a hand in the development of this department. So again, that was the seed that Kerin sowed, and it's certainly grown from the early days. Now, to go back to 1992, I was an immunologist, so I didn't know anything about design of studies. And the thing that Kerin soon put me in contact was these very carefully controlled dietary studies. And I came in contact with a crossover design randomised control trial, and it was a lot of decisions and discussion about how these really carefully designed nutritional studies would work. And I think that was also a great strength of Kerin's in being able to design these studies which were very carefully controlled. And the first study of that type that I became involved with was with Kerin and also with Jane Muir, who's here today too. And it was looking at the kind of diet that most people with diabetes at that time were put on, which was a high carbohydrate, low fat diet. And people in our society were doing very well on it because often the choices for the carbohydrate were pretty poor quality carbohydrate foods, which was the trouble. So based on some work by Anton Garg, was to look at a different sort of diet where there was a higher fat content, but that fat was a healthy fat mainly from olive oil, monounsaturated fat. So we did one of these randomised crossover design studies, and the results were pretty clear that the modified fat diet was actually of quite similar benefit to the patients. They did just as well on it. Interestingly, in view of all the hype about the high carbohydrate diet, people on the higher fat diet did not gain weight, which we were quite surprised about because we sort of expected that they might. And they actually preferred the higher fat diet. They thought that was a much easier diet to stay on. So that was interesting. So we then became really quite interested in what was the effect of the higher fat diet on body weight and body composition, using the DEXA, which had sort of become available fairly recently. And we looked at the upper body fat compared to the lower body fat. And basically from this study, we're able to show that, again, on that high carbohydrate diet, there was people could lose a little bit of weight, but their fat distribution changed in a way that was not really very beneficial. They became more like apples and less like pears, which was not such a good change, whereas on the other diet, there was much less tendency for that to happen. Another study of the same type looked also at the effect of exercise and was able to show that the upper body fat, with a lot of regular walking, 1 hour at least every day, you could really help people with diabetes lose that upper body fat. And finally, I don't want to go on too many of these studies, but with Sunil Pierce, who was a colleague for many years, he was able to show that we got interested in whether saturated fat would be oxidised as quickly as monounsaturated fat, and we found it actually was much less quickly oxidised, so more likely to be stored as adipose tissue. And this one of these studies with Sunil, we were able to show that whereas the yellow bars are the saturated fat diet, people put on body weight, they put on fat, whereas on a diet with a lot of unsaturated fat, they lost weight and they lost fat mass because it was oxidised more quickly. And now turning, around about the time we'd finished those studies, Kerin was getting very much more interested in the Mediterranean diet. I think, Catherine, you're going to talk probably about that, so I'm not encroaching on you too much. But just to say, we did have a look, because I was still interested in why these high-fat diets, why people didn't put on weight. You know, everybody expected that they'd put on weight. And then you look in the Mediterranean diet at the amount of vegetables in that diet. So it's not just fat, it's also fat with a lot of vegetables. So I made 2 different types of meals which have got exactly the same sort of fat, but one is on the left is a meal which is more like a Western diet, and it's high energy density, and you can imagine if you had a plate full of food like that, you could continue eating because it's not very bulky. Whereas on a typical Mediterranean diet with the same amount of fat, all those vegetables just bulk you out and you it's harder to overeat. So from that, I became much more aware of the real importance, not just the fat content of the Mediterranean diet, the type of healthy olive oil, but also there's all those vegetables that were there. And after working in that area for a while, I was at Monash, and I was also at Baker IDI for a while. And this is where I got swamped with paper at one point, because Kerin started getting me to do some work in systematic reviews. And it was fairly early days then, and we were sort of working out how they should be done. And Kerin was terrific at being really critical about the papers and which paper we should look at and which one should be summarily dismissed as not being suitable to include. So this resulted in 2 lots of evidence-based guidelines, one in 2002 and one in 2009 for Diabetes Australia and NNH and MIC. And I think that work is continuing, and now lots of PhD students, they all seem to start their thesis off with a systematic review, but in those days we weren't so used to carrying them out. I certainly do remember bringing home a huge lots of paper of all the studies to have a look at. So I just want to thank you, Kerin, very much for your amazing research leadership, from which I've benefited so much. And as everybody here have said, that Kerin's got such a marvellously inquiring and rigorous mind, and it's just a delight to be involved in any of her studies. And for me, she showed me that good nutrition, it's just not a matter of technical knowledge or talking about nutrients. It's actually a way of life and, an appreciation of good food, not just the nutrients. And apart from the good food and the whole diet approach, embracing the social, and as I came to know more about food, the political dimensions of food, which I'm much more keenly aware of than when I started off as a very strict scientist. I didn't understand the politics, and now I think the politics is just so important. The politics of food and the food industry and the effect of the food industry on our lives is just amazing and very difficult to combat, but needs to be combated. So I just want to finish, Kerin, with a sort of a paraphrase from Winston Churchill, of all people. And he said, we are all worms, but you, Kerin, are a glowworm. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerin. So Jane Muir's next. Jane, I've never met you, but I've read your stuff and very interested in FODMAPs.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks for the invite. I'm up there. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invite. And it's lovely to be here. And I'm going to have to start with an apology, because I don't have a lot of photographs, Kerin. I'm sorry. I don't have a lot of slides either, because I've been so snowed under with NHMRC applications at the moment. And I know you'll understand that I feel I have not devoted as much time as I should have to this. And I really wish I'd spoken to Karen Walker before I came, because she reminded me of the green bananas, and more about that later. But I'm, as you see from this, a long association with Kerin. So I first met Kerin when I undertook the Graduate Diploma of Dietetics at Deakin University. And I'd come from just finishing a PhD in biochemistry, which Kerin found fascinating. And it was a very odd entry into doing dietetics, actually having done quite a lot of research really in an area. It was not related to dietetics, it was related to plasma membrane signalling events, which I can see that Richard's sitting there. And it's just basically, it was such an odd sort of transition, but I'd always been interested in nutrition. So it felt to me it was something I had to do. And so I did the course and I graduated, and then I started working in a medical centre. And every few months, Kerin would ring me and say, "Have you had enough yet, Jane? Are you coming back to research?" And after I think it was about 9 months, I said, "Okay, I'm coming back. I'll have enough." So I joined Kerin down at Deakin in Geelong, and it was a terrific time actually. Deakin University there. Kerin was new. There was a big group. There was Andy. Andy's here somewhere. Fantastic group. It was one of the best times, I think, for my research career, was that collegial, group and all the interesting research that was being done. It was just a fantastic dynamic. It was a fantastic culture, and it was just a wonderful time to be, doing research. But I started with Kerin in the gut. So that's what this, I've drawn 2 pictures, and this is about the gut and our journey through the digestive tract, really. And this is where I did my research with Kerin. But I think if you look at this, it's also not only just a gut, it's a roadmap, I think, to how we should conduct nutrition research, which is another thing I think Kerin taught me, was really how best to go about really high quality nutrition research. And so it's a roadmap, I think, to that. So my second slide, and this is where the green bananas should be in that gut. But basically, we were interested in indigestible carbohydrates. So that's carbohydrates that can't be digested in the small intestine, so they work their way through to the bowel. And particularly interested in starches, and that is resistant starch. And the many papers, I suppose, I've done with Kerin, the key papers, I think, the first one was really I had to develop a way of measuring them in food. Kerin said, we've got to be able to measure them in food. There needs to be a test. So this is where actually I started with her, my postdoc, with her down at Deakin. And for some reason, I don't know, but anyway, Kerin decided that I had to chew the food. There was the start of the assay was me actually chewing the food and spitting it into these containers, and then it would go off to the lab and be analysed. And I seriously published the paper, and the first step was chewing, actually someone chewing the food, which everyone found was hilarious. Kerin and I thought it was quite logical. I don't know why people really had trouble with that. But it's a highly cited paper now, and it's funny because resistant starch is really coming back into vogue. The immunologists have discovered resistant starch.
They've discovered the bowel.
They have discovered the bowel, and they've discovered short-chain fatty acids. So a lot of this is coming back now. Actually, it's just so funny how things, go in cycles. So that was important, and we set about screening foods and then developing a diet that could be used to understand the physiological impact of these starches in food. And that is where the green bananas came in, because we found the green bananas were loaded with resistant starch. And so I had to set about, this is what Kerin was reminding me about, peeling tons of green bananas and then freeze drying the green bananas so we could make a powder and put it into food. So basically, that took up a lot of time, and I had forgotten. Obviously, I'd wiped it from my memory in some way. So that led to the next kind of major paper, I suppose, we had together, which was the understanding the physiological consequences of these resistant starches in the gut. And that really is, I think it was a really important paper. There was a lot of work in that, and there was a lot of green bananas as well. But there were other sources of resistant starch. And I think that it's still highly cited as well, because again, that's all coming back. People are very interested in short-chain fatty acids and really maybe circulating short-chain fatty acids now. So they were the 2 key areas, and it really took my research focus into the bowel. Kerin, fantastic mentor and inspiration that she is. The rigour of writing grants, writing papers, conducting fantastic studies, gold standard studies. And I think also the importance of, dietitians doing PhDs, so ongoing. So really just raising the bar. And I think that, the roadmap here, the gut and the roadmap includes that professionalism, I suppose. And I do visit other countries, and I think people look at the model that we have in Australia, and that these fantastic dietitians with PhDs, and they're making real impact in nutrition research all around. We make a big impact around the world in our own areas. They see it's a really good model. So thanks for that. And I'm continuing that. In fact, I've called myself Head of Translation Nutrition Science at Monash now, and that is something I do. And the other wonderful thing I learned from Kerin is how our work is not really finished, once you publish it. It really has to be translated. And that is actually the toughest thing. But doing the research is actually, getting the money is easier, and doing the research and actually getting it out there so people can use it. That is the toughest thing. And I learned that from Kerin, and I devote myself to doing that. And I've been successful with FODMAP. So we're doing that with FODMAP, but it's all from Kerin, I think, inspiring that. So I'm still in the gut, firmly in the gut. Kerin's passed through, you've passed through. It was a challenging area of research because we had to do fecal stuff, but Kerin, you said it's a very challenging area of research, and it is, but we did it. You've passed through. I'm still there, but thank you for the inspiration and the support and ongoing. I know you'll always be interested in what everyone's done who's had contact with you. So thanks, many thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jane. And Sandra. I can't even begin to introduce you, Sandra, so I won't start. Thank you.
And there are some important things that I want to say, but I think I can say them fairly quickly. And I have no pictures, but it's a great honour to be here today celebrating Kerin's work and her role in my life. She is incredibly generous. I don't think we've ever published one paper together. I was a mentor on one of her program grants, but I, for the life of me, can't see what she got out of me. But I have a long list of things that I've got from Kerin in terms of my professional journey. So she's really been one of the most positive mentors in my career, and I'll just go through and tell you a little bit about those steps. I think people underestimate the impact of mentors for professional people. We've rarely been in the same workplace, but she's been a mentor and a friend, and today that's what I want to celebrate. I first met her, I was a medical student, maybe second or third year, sitting in a lecture theatre at the University of Newcastle. Recently out of high school, a West Australian on the other side of the country, and she came to give an Aboriginal health lecture, and she was talking about her work in the Kimberley. So that was my first impression, the enormous enthusiasm, and she spoke so positively about Aboriginal people, Aboriginal culture, and I think in terms of a strengths-based approach to Aboriginal health, she personified that in the 1980s, and it was that impression. So quite a lot of time went until I next met Kerin, and I think Paul said this morning she was a prophet. So back in the 80s she was talking about these issues. And then again, the other side is a conference in Melbourne in 2010. She was really one of the earliest people I recall talking about chronic disease, lifestyle, and the impact on Aboriginal people. The next time I met her was in 2001. I was a PhD student on an NHMRC committee, busy trying to finish my PhD, and it was there was research committee and there was a strategic development research committee, SRDC. Jack Best was the chair. John Delaney was the Aboriginal person on council, and he chaired our committee. And Kerin, I think, was the only scientist and researcher on the Research Agenda Working Group. And I was struck by the enthusiasm and the positive influence she had on that committee. So we were there just at a certain point in time. This Health is Life report had just been released by the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Health by the Federal Parliament. One of the recommendations of their report right at the end was that the NHMRC should commit 5% of their research funds to Aboriginal health research. So the letter came to the Chair of Council and the CEO, and we were there at the time when they were trying to figure out what to do, how to respond to that letter from the Parliament. There was a meeting in Hobart. Kerin, I don't know if you recall, but you came to breakfast with me before our meeting, and Helen Evans, who was the head of the Office for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health. We knew that the CEO was coming to us today, the chair of SRDC, and they were going to say to her org, what shall we do? Tell us what to do. So we had a little breakfast caucus. And I remember saying to Kerin, you know, I've nothing on the web back then, even recently in the 2000s. I've read the booklet which basically describes who the NHMRC is, what their function is, some excerpts from their legislation, and they really probably have a role to do more in this area. And we agreed that if the rest of the committee was agreeable, I'd do a first draft of something called the roadmap, and then we'd all work together as a committee, take it to national consultation, and we'd take something to council before the end of the triennium. And Kerin was a positive, and I think we relied. She'd been on council, she'd been on research committee, she had a detailed knowledge of health and medical research, and she was supportive. And so I think, you know, there's a legacy which is all of the opportunities right around Australia for more positive contributions by health and medical researchers. Kerin was there, and that was, I think that's one of the biggest legacies, those contributions. I finished my PhD and I was a freshly minted postdoc. And I'd come from a terrific institute in Perth, the Institute for Child Health Research, and I ended up in Darwin with my family, and I was working with Kerin. She was my supervisor, and that difficult transition from PhD to, you know, doing post-PhD work, I was only there for a year. But I went to Kerin and she said, okay, write a fellowship. So I thought, okay, and she guided me through writing a fellowship, and she said, okay, write a project grant. Generously, she didn't think, oh, here's Sandra, she can do some of my research, or she was just a true scientist. She knew that I'd come out of a body of work and I would have my own thoughts about where next. And the mentoring and the guidance she gave me was more about how to take what I'd already done and the ideas I already had to the next stage. So I'd never written a grant. She said, write the first page. And it was terrific working with someone out of such a strong science background and from such strong scientific training in Australia and other parts of the world. She goes, Sandra, for every grant you need a testable hypothesis. I sort of knew that, but I hadn't really thought it through because my training was in medicine. And so every grant I've ever written since has a testable hypothesis. And I talk to my students and people I supervise about the structure of science and the structure of what we do. But Kerin was terrific in sorting that out in me and taking me beyond my PhD training. I was only there for a year, so my personal life took over and there were reasons why I had to leave. Both Barbara and Kerin were terrific because as professionals, there are people who look after and support us professionally, but there are often times in your life where you need a blend of professional and personal support, and Kerin was terrific. I often look back and think of Kerin and Barbara and thank them for being there because I didn't have family in Darwin. It was a tough time and they were wonderful. So I left after a year. I often wonder, what if I'd been there for the whole of her 5 years at Menzies? I took up a terrific job at the Sachs Institute, and after 4 years I thought, well, Sydney, I'm from the West. I don't have any family. I'm not quite ready to go back to Perth. I've got some cousins in Melbourne. I rang up Kerin. I said, Kerin, I'm interested in working in Melbourne because I'll have better family supports there, and do you know of any jobs? So a few months went by and she was looking at different possibilities. She rang me back and she said the Baker Institute have a growing program in Aboriginal health. They're interested in talking to you. And I said, okay, I'll give Gary Jennings a call. Kerin was working there part-time and I didn't make the call. I'd sort of gone on with thinking. She rang me back, I don't know if it was a month or two. She goes, they're really interested in talking to you. So I thought, well, she's such a good person, I'm going to go and talk to them. I don't think I'll move to Melbourne. But my experience during that visit was terrific. I've had a terrific, productive time over almost a decade at the Baker. I was thrown back into a room with nobody telling me what to do, but Sandra, what are your ideas? Where are you taking your science? Surrounded by terrific scientists. And for the last decade, I've built my own research team. Some of our work has been terrific and productive, and other areas have been not as productive and haven't had the impact we would have liked them to have had. But Kerin guided me through that step. She stayed for a year and she took up her job at the Sansom Institute in UniSA. But I used to keep in touch with her. Every year I'd come across and we'd go to Barretto's at the bottom of this building at the University of Melbourne, and she was still mentoring me. She would read every fellowship application I wrote. Every time I needed help personally or I needed something for one of the people working with me, she was so generous with her time, and that's what I want to celebrate. And this is our first week at the University of Melbourne. I thought I might be writing myself into her retirement plan because, of course, she lives just up the road, and I'm hoping that those conversations, those rich scientific conversations, can occasionally continue. And I just want to thank you, Kerin. You've been a wonderful mentor, a terrific friend. It's been fun because I love science. You know, medicine's been the vocation, but I love science. Everything, or most of what I know about nutritional science has come from coffee conversations with Kerin and the work and the mentoring. So thank you.
Well, we're running a bit late, and so we're going to give Kerin a rest from questions until the end. So thank you very much, and we'll break for lunch and come back at come back 5 minutes ago. Anyway, no, we'll come back at 1:40. Yeah, that's enough. Yeah, thank you.